Today, we're kind of tearing down a story you probably know well. 1776, liberty, the heroic founding fathers.
Right, but we're looking at sources that really flip that script. We're going deep into perspectives, particularly anti-colonial and decolonial ones, that ask a fundamentally different question.
Yeah, a pretty radical question, actually. What if, for the vast population of enslaved Africans, 1776 wasn't about gaining freedom?
What if it was the exact opposite, a kind of counter-revolution,
A counter-revolution aimed at what?
aimed at preserving and even expanding slavery, led by the colonial elites, the big planters, the wealthy merchants who felt their whole way of life, their economic engine, was under threat.
Under threat from Britain,
Yeah.
the very power they were supposedly fighting for liberty from.
Precisely. That's the core of it. Our mission today is to unpack how African resistance, combined with all the geopolitical maneuvering between Spain, France, and London, wasn't just background noise.
You're saying it was the main event, the driving force.
Absolutely. We need to understand the very practical, often financial reasons why these elites felt they had to break away from the crown to protect their system.
And right away, the sources we looked at point to this huge issue, this kind of trust deficit, right?
A massive one. Africans in the colonies quickly figured out their legal status was, well, uniquely bad under the English system. They saw themselves as property, chattel.
So they started looking elsewhere for leverage, for freedom.
They did. They calculated, quite rationally, that their best chance might actually lie with the British crown, or even with rivals like Spain. They weren't just passive victims. Many actively sided against the rebels.
That completely reframes the standard narrative. All right, let's dig in. Where do we start to understand how this counter-revolution idea builds up?
We have to go back. Way back before 1776, back to the late 17th century and the explosion of the slave trade itself. It starts with economics and politics in London.
Not with pamphlets and ideals in Philadelphia.
Not primarily, no. Think about the Glorious Revolution in 1688. It wasn't just about kings and parliament in the abstract. It marked a huge power shift
Towards who?
towards a rising merchant class, a class that was really laying the groundwork for, well, modern capitalism. And what did they need for that colonial capitalist project to boom in?
Let me guess. More labor.
More enslaved labor. And the king's control over the slave trade through the Royal African Company, the REC, was getting in their way. They wanted to break that monopoly.
So this is like proto-corporate lobbying, but for the right to traffic human beings more freely.
That's exactly what it looks like. They framed it as the RAC hindering development. We have these incredible petitions from Virginia and Maryland merchants in 1696.
What did they say?
They argued straight up to the House of Commons that the shortage of enslaved Africans, caused by the RAC monopoly, was holding back the tobacco colonies. They wanted the market opened up.
It's pretty stark, isn't it? This foundational push, often framed as being about liberty, actually starts with the demand for more enslavement to boost profits.
It highlights the central contradiction right from the start. And the lobbying worked. The floodgates started to open.
What did that look like numerically?
The change was dramatic. In the 15 years before 1698, while the RAC monopoly was strong, maybe 5,500 Africans were brought to the mainland colonies.
Okay.
In the 15 years after 1698, as private traders rushed in, that number jumps to over 15,000. A threefold increase, basically.
Wow.
And it just kept accelerating. By 1750, the trade was officially declared even more free and open.
It sounds like a textbook example of early free trade thinking. Immense profits for some.
Immense profits for the colonial enterprise, yes. But the sources call it what it was, a world historic defeat for Africa and Africans.
True.
Devastation.
And the sheer scale of this forced migration must have been staggering. The economic stakes were huge, especially with sugar in the Caribbean, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Got-
The Caribbean sugar colonies were the real cash cow for London. Sugar was unbelievably profitable. By the mid-19th century, it was Britain's #2 import by value.
So the wealth generated there gave those planters huge influence back in London.
Huge influence. Think of William Beckford, Lord Mayor of London, incredibly wealthy from his Jamaican sugar plantations.
The one they called Negro whipping Beckford.
That's the one. It shows you just how deeply connected London's political and financial elite were to this brutal system. The sources argue this influx of African labor literally bailed out the colonial enterprise.
Bailed it out. It was struggling before.
It had been precarious. Up until the late 17th century, there were real fears about its survival. This massive forced labor importation stabilized it and made it wildly profitable.
But that profitability came with a massive side effect, didn't it? A demographic time bomb for the settlers.
Exactly. They imported not just labor, but also resistance and instability. Look at the numbers. Africans and their descendants go from maybe 7% of the mainland population in 1690
Okay.
to around 40% between 1750 and 1780. 40%.
That's enormous.
And in crucial colonies like South Carolina, it was even more stark. Africans were the majority, over 60% of the population from the 1720s, right through the Revolution.
So you have this situation, incredible wealth being generated, but built on a foundation of people who vastly outnumbered the colonists in some areas, and who were understandably infuriated Africans who remembered freedom.
Precisely. It created spectacular profit, but it also delivered constant, simmering, and sometimes boiling terror. It necessitated a state of perpetual vigilance and repression.
Which leads us right into the next part. This idea of perpetual sedition. Slavery wasn't a stable system. It was inherently unstable.
Inherently. It couldn't be anything else. It bred what the sources call angry disaffection. Plots, uprisings, resistance. These weren't exceptions. They were the norm across all the colonies, Caribbean and mainland.
It was baked into the system.
Absolutely. The fear among the settlers was constant. You see plots documented everywhere. And early on, Barbados, 1649, a plan not just to kill the planters, but significantly to keep their wives and enslave their children and the white servants.
A complete social revolution.
Exactly. And Jamaica was practically defined by the Maroon Wars for decades, these communities of escaped Africans waging guerrilla warfare, until a very fragile settlement in the 1730s.
And on the mainland, the resistance could be quieter, but maybe even more terrifying for the planters, like poisoning.
Poisoning was a huge source of fear, especially in places like South Carolina by the 1750s. Enslaved Africans, particularly herbalists with deep botanical knowledge, could strike invisibly.
Hitting the masters directly in their own home.
Yes. It created hysteria. And arson was another common tool. Think about Thomas Jefferson's home, Shadwell Plantation, burning down in 1770, widely suspected to be arson by the enslaved.
A very direct message.
A powerful act of resistance. All this constantly reinforced the settlers' feeling that they were living on top of a volcano, that their entire system was precarious.
Okay, so that's the internal pressure. But it gets even more dangerous for the settlers when this internal resistance connects with external enemies, right?
That's the crucial link. And Africans were politically savvy. They understood the differences between the European powers.
How so?
Under English law, enslaved people were treated increasingly as pure chattel, as property, with almost no recourse. French and Spanish systems, while still brutal, sometimes offered paths to manumission or recognized a degree of legal personhood, however limited. They weren't identical systems of oppression.
And Africans recognized this distinction.
Clearly, the patterns of escape tell the story. Where did rebellious Africans flee from?
British colonies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From the Carolinas South to Spanish Florida. From New York north to French Quebec. From Jamaica across to Spanish Cuba. They almost never fled into British territory from Spanish or French areas.
They were voting with their feet, basically, calculating the odds.
Making a strategic choice. The sources had this great phrase: they saw Spain as having the cleanest dirty shirt. Not perfect by any means, but comparatively better than the British system from their perspective.
And Spain knew this. They actively used it.
Oh, Madrid played this card deliberately. It was state policy. Promise freedom, promise land, destabilize the British colonies from within. We have orders from Havana as early as 1742.
What kind of orders?
Explicit instructions to send militias composed of Africans into South Carolina, their mission. To convoke the slaves of the English and offer liberty and land in Florida.
Wow. So this wasn't just a passive refuge. It was an active strategy of recruitment and insurgency aimed right at the heart of the British colonial economy.
It was economic and military warfare, using the colonists' greatest vulnerability against them.
This threat was so real it literally shaped the map, didn't it, with the founding of Georgia?
Precisely. Georgia, founded in 1733, was conceived explicitly as a buffer zone, a white firewall.
Why white?
Because initially African slavery was banned in Georgia. The idea was to create a loyal, militarily capable population of white settlers positioned directly between the powder keg of slave-majority South Carolina and Spanish Florida.
It was a strategic military outpost designed to protect the slave economy next door.
That's exactly what it was. But even that didn't stop the inevitable explosion. The Stono Uprising in South Carolina, 1739.
Described as the bloodiest slave revolt in colonial North American history.
It confirmed every single fear the settlers had. And crucially, They didn't just see it as an internal revolt.
They blamed Spain.
They were convinced of it. They believed the Africans would not have made this insurrection had they not depended on Florida as a destination. And they had evidence, or what they saw as evidence.
Like what?
The suspicious arrival just before the uprising of a Spanish official in Charleston, accompanied by an English-speaking black man. They believed this man was sent specifically to incite the revolt.
So the internal and external threats were completely intertwined in their minds.
Absolutely. And if you trace this whole dynamic, the unstable demographics, the constant resistance, the Spanish exploitation, you see that the big imperial conflicts like the 7 Years' War weren't just about territory in the abstract.
They were about London trying to stabilize this incredibly volatile, incredibly profitable, but inherently dangerous project based on mass enslavement.
The settlers' pursuit of profit through slavery had become a major security liability for the entire British Empire.
Okay, so the system is inherently unstable from within and vulnerable to external manipulation. What finally pushes the colonists towards outright rebellion against London?
It's London itself starting to change, or at least the perception that London is changing, particularly regarding slavery. And this change wasn't necessarily driven by pure morality initially.
What drove it then?
Military and geopolitical necessity. London realized that to compete effectively with Spain and France, who are already using armed Africans.
Like those militias operating out of Havana.
Exactly. Spain had armed black militias way back in the 16th century. London realized it needed to adopt these best practices of colonialism. They were becoming increasingly reliant on African soldiers and sailors for their global empire.
And that creates a problem for the ideology of slavery, right?
A huge problem. It's very, very difficult to maintain the fiction that someone is mere property when you're also handing them a weapon and asking them to fight and die for the crown. Their status inherently starts to shift. Abolitionist sentiment in London grew partly because of this practical military reality.
Were there specific incidents that brought this home to the colonists that showed London might actually elevate Africans?
There's this incredibly provocative image described in the sources from Boston in 1768. Picture this: Afro-Caribbean drummers, part of the British 29th Regiment, publicly whipping white soldiers on the Boston Common.
Wow. The symbolism there is explosive.
Absolutely explosive for the colonists. It fueled paranoia. It looked like proof that London would eventually arm the enslaved and use them to crush colonial dissent, especially since the colonies were already seen as potential economic rivals.
And this fear wasn't unfounded given the colonists' own behavior, was it? They weren't exactly loyal subjects when profit was involved.
Not at all. Their loyalty was conditional, at best. During Britain's wars against France and the Dutch, the colonial merchants engaged in massive clandestine trade with the enemy.
Selling them supplies, buying their goods.
Yes, selling foreign sugar, buying foreign merchandise. It was blatant economic treason from London's perspective.
Undermining the war effort for their own gain.
Directly aiding Britain's most dangerous rivals, as the sources put it. London saw this as causing irreparable injury to British commerce, potentially leading to impending ruin. It showed the colonies prioritized their own profits above the empire.
Then comes the 7 Years' War, ending in 1763. Britain wins big, gets France out of Canada, Spain out of Florida. You'd think the colonists would be thrilled.
They were, initially. But the victory ironically became catastrophic for London's control over the mainland colonies.
How catastrophic? Why?
Because it removed the external threats, France and Spain, that had kept the colonists dependent on British military protection. Suddenly, they didn't need the redcoats in the same way.
And with those threats gone,
they could focus all their resentment, all their ire, directly on London itself. They felt secure geographically. Their slave-based economy was booming, and now London's attempts to tax them and control their expansion felt intolerable.
Especially since London wanted them to help pay for a war fought largely for their benefit.
Exactly. The taxes, plus the proclamation of 1763 restricting westward expansion, that hit the elite land speculators like Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, right where it hurt.
So it wasn't just abstract taxation without representation. It was about protecting their ability to expand the slave system westward.
That was a huge part of it. Their fortunes were tied to land speculation and the expansion of slave-based agriculture. Secession becomes, in part, a strategy to protect those investments from metropolitan control.
Alongside these geopolitical shifts, there was also a change in attitude in London itself, a kind of growing disgust with slavery.
Yes, a definite metropolitan scorn, as the sources term it. Slavery began to be seen by many in London as a sort of brutish American phenomenon. uncivilized.
Fueled by the hypocrisy they saw.
Absolutely. Colonists constantly prating about liberty while holding hundreds of thousands in brutal bondage. It made them look like tyrants in the eyes of many Londoners,
Yeah.
especially with a large, vocal black population in London itself. Maybe 15,000 people pushing anti-slavery ideas.
So the colonists felt judged, looked down upon by the metropolis.
And they feared this moral judgment could easily translate into legal action that would undermine their entire society. Which brings us to the immediate sparks.
Right. The situation is incredibly tense. What were the specific events in the early 1770s that really pushed things over the edge?
Three key things, really, all circling back to slavery and property rights. First, a legal earthquake. The Somerset case in London, 1772.
Why was this case decided in England such a big deal across the Atlantic?
Because it seemed to strike at the legal heart of slavery. James Somerset was an enslaved man brought to England, who escaped, was recaptured, and sued for his freedom. Lord Mansfield ruled that slavery was so odious it wasn't supported by common law in England.
Okay, in England. But the colonists heard something else.
They heard the death knell for slavery everywhere in the empire. The reports that reached the colonies often framed it as abolishing slavery outright. The logic was terrifying for them. If common law doesn't support slavery here, why should it support it there?
The insecurity must have shot through the roof.
Instantly. Slaveholders like Charles Carroll in Maryland reported their enslaved people becoming cocksure almost immediately. They saw the potential implications. It felt like the Crown, through its courts, was now willing to directly interfere with their fundamental property rights. A yawning gap opened between the colonies and London on this core issue.
Then, the same year, 1772, there's a confrontation involving smuggling and resistance. The Gaspee Affair.
Right. The Gaspee was a British customs schooner aggressively cracking down on the colonists' lucrative smuggling, that clandestine trade we talked about. So colonists in Rhode Island boarded it and burned it to the waterline.
An act of defiance.
Yeah.
But what was the tipping point that really inflamed the situation?
It was the Crown's reaction. London wanted the perpetrators sent to England for trial. Major figures, like John Brown, co-founder of Brown University, were implicated. But the real kicker, the main witness against these powerful white elites,
Let me guess.
was an African or mulatto man named Aaron Briggs.
So the Crown was prepared to use the testimony of a black man to potentially convict some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the colonies.
Exactly. The fact that Briggs' testimony was given much plausibility, that it was the foundation of this inquiry, was deeply shocking to the colonial leadership.
It challenged the whole racial hierarchy.
Fundamentally, it raised the specter of Africans being placed on a footing of equality with masters, which Lieutenant Governor Bull of South Carolina had warned was incredibly dangerous for maintaining control. Taking a black man's word over a white gentleman's. Unthinkable and terrifying for them. It suggested London no longer respected the racial lines essential to their power.
Okay, so we have a legal threat and a challenge to the racial order. What was the final nail in the coffin?
The military threat. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia, November 1775.
Dunmore, the royal governor, what did he proclaim?
Facing open rebellion, he issued a direct threat. Any enslaved person or indentured servant who fled their rebel master and joined the king's forces would be granted freedom. He threatened to unleash armed Africans against the revolution.
He ultimate fear realized.
It was the bombshell. This wasn't abstract legal theory anymore. This was the Crown explicitly stating it would weaponize the enslaved population against the colonists.
And this wasn't just a local Virginia issue.
No, the fear instantly spread. Down in South Carolina and Georgia, rumors flew that London was planning a multi-pronged attack using redcoats, freed Africans, and indigenous allies to crush the rebellion.
This must have solidified the decision for the elite, especially those heavily invested in slavery.
Absolutely. Think about George Washington, deeply indebted to British creditors, massive slave owner. John Hancock, one of Boston's biggest slave owners. For them, Dunmore's proclamation wasn't just a political move, it was an existential economic threat.
Stick with the Crown and risk losing your property, maybe even your life, at the hands of freed slaves. Or break away and create a new government specifically designed to protect slave property.
That was the choice. The sources state bluntly that the new republic was called into being, partly by this guilty fear born by cruel exploitation of Africans. Secession became the necessary step to secure their wealth, their power, and their system of racial control from a crown that now seemed willing to dismantle it. It was in essence a counter-revolution to protect slavery.
So the rebellion succeeds, the new republic is formed. What's the immediate result of this counter-revolution for the enslaved population?
It was frankly a disaster for most Africans on the continent. The victory of the rebels didn't usher in liberty for all. Instead, it ossified, it hardened a rigid racial caste system for decades.
Because the new nation was founded precisely on the fear of black freedom.
Exactly. Having fought London, partly because they feared armed Africans, the victorious settlers now viewed all black people, free or enslaved, as potential enemies within. Thinly disguised revolutionaries, as one source puts it, always ready to collaborate with foreign foes. This deep suspicion became foundational to the new republic's identity.
And the structure of the new nation reflected this.
It had to. The republic prioritized white men in arms, the militias, specifically to police the enslaved population and protect the system. It doubled down on racist despotism, enshrined implicitly and sometimes explicitly in its laws and constitution, while simultaneously expanding onto indigenous lands. It became a haven for European immigrants, but clamped down even harder on Africans.
But even amidst this defeat, African agency remained crucial, didn't it? You mentioned the numbers who sided with the British.
Yes, and it's a critical point often ignored. Around 20,000 enslaved Africans are estimated to have joined the British side during the war.
20,000, that's a huge number.
It's roughly the same number as white loyalists who actively fought for the crown. It shows this wasn't a marginal phenomenon. It was a significant political and military choice made by tens of thousands of people.
What does that tell us about their perspective?
It tells us they made a clear calculation. They decided that freedom and an enhanced life were more likely to come from the metropolis, from the crown, than from the revolutionary slaveholders demanding liberty for themselves.
They saw the rebels' claims of liberty as hypocritical, essentially.
Deeply hypocritical and self-serving. And this strategy, looking for external leverage against domestic oppression, became a recurring theme in African American history.
How so?
Because of their historically consistent and staunch opposition to the plans of the slaveholding elite, first rebel, then Republican. When the system at home is built to oppress you, you logically look for allies outside that system, whether it was Spain, London, later Mexico, or even in the 20th century, finding ideological allies in places like Moscow or Tokyo during the Cold War. It's a pragmatic response to systemic exclusion.
And this analysis connects that historical opposition directly to ongoing struggles.
It suggests that the discrimination and inequality faced by African Americans today aren't disconnected historical accidents. They stem, in significant part, from this foundational reality. The Republic was forged in direct opposition to their ancestors' aspirations for freedom, and that opposition has shaped power structures ever since.
The Republic was born fighting against their freedom, essentially.
In many ways, yes, fighting to preserve a system that denied their freedom. That legacy casts a long shadow.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. The core argument we've unpacked from these sources is that the drive for American independence in 1776, especially for the powerful Southern planters and Northern merchants tied to the slave economy, was less about high-minded ideals of liberty.
And much more about a practical, almost desperate need to protect their enormous wealth and political control, which is based overwhelmingly on enslaved labor.
And the system felt threatened from multiple directions.
All right, three main interlocking pressures. First, the constant internal pressure of slave resistance, the plots, the poisonings, the uprisings, the perpetual sedition.
Second, the external threat from European rivals, especially Spain, who were actively using the promise of freedom to destabilize the British colonies by encouraging slaves to flee or revolt.
And third, the growing perception, based on things like the Somerset case and Dunmore's proclamation, that London itself was drifting towards policies that could undermine or even abolish slavery, whether for moral reasons or, more likely, for military and imperial expediency.
So secession becomes a defensive strategy, a counter-revolution to preemptively stop these threats and create a new nation explicitly dedicated to protecting slave property and white supremacy.
Exactly. It's a perspective that forces us to see the Founding Fathers not just as heroes of liberty, but also as actors, desperately trying to preserve a brutal system of exploitation that was becoming increasingly untenable within the British Empire.
The great leap forward of capitalism and republicanism from this view is inseparable from the violence and oppression required to maintain slavery.
They are two sides of the same coin in this analysis. The wealth that funded the revolution and the new republic was extracted directly from enslaved bodies.
Which leaves us with a really challenging final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If this republic was called into being, as these sources argue, partly by the guilty fear of slaveholders, the fear that the king they were rebelling against might actually free and arm the people they enslaved.
Then what does it mean to trace the nation's founding liberty to that precise moment? A moment when a huge segment of the population wasn't looking to the rebels for freedom, but was actually looking toward the king, toward the supposed tyrant, as their potential liberator.
It forces us to ask, whose liberty was actually being fought for and established in 1776, and whose historical perspective have we traditionally privileged when we tell that story?